I'm Alex Stone, former military service member and law enforcement officer, now CEO of Echelon Protective Services, one of the fastest growing private security firms on the West Coast. And this is Ride Along, where our guest and I witness firsthand the issues affecting our community. I believe our proven method of enacting meaningful change through compassion and understanding is the best way to make our streets a safer place and truly achieve security through community. Hey, Alex Stone here. Welcome back to the Ride Along. Today's guest is Will Lathrop, a very good friend of mine. He's running for Attorney General here in Oregon. Will, introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Will Lathrop, and like you said, I'm running for Attorney General of Oregon, and it's a pleasure to be here today. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, totally. So Will and I met about a year ago. We were at an event where you were speaking, and you were speaking directly about trying to interdict organized crime, specifically cartel activity. During this event, a commotion happened outside. I run outside, and we see a teenager who I later identified through law enforcement as a member of a cartel, stabbing a homeless person because he owed him money for drugs. Mm-hmm. And so that really kind of sums up why you're running for Attorney General, really.
Yeah, it was very, not coincidental, it's just sad to see that the thing I was talking about, drug crime and the violent crimes that comes with the drug cartel, was actually happening outside while I was speaking.
Yeah, and this was a nice neighborhood.
Yes, it was.
Nice area. We're downtown, and it was very organized. You know, the way they did it, and so for the people who don't know you, the audience at home, kind of give them a little background of who you are, where you come from, and why you're running for Attorney General.
Yeah, I'm from a small town called Joseph, Oregon, on the east side of the state. I came to the west side of the state, to the Willamette Valley, to get my law degree, and then I was a prosecutor in Oregon for about 10 years and focused on child sex abuse. I also handled homicide, adult sexual assault, and domestic violence cases, but my major focus was on protecting children from violence. I was then recruited away to Washington, D.C. to do that work at the national level. And from there, I was hired by a global human rights organization to lead multinational teams in Africa. So before running for Attorney General, I was leading teams first in East Africa and then West Africa to combat violence against women and in human trafficking cases. It was never really in my game plan to run for public office. I was very happy doing public service nationally or internationally, but each summer I would come back and just watching the decay of law and order and governance in the state of Oregon, it was like watching my state die. So I felt duty bound to come back and try to be a wave of something new.
That's excellent. Could you give a little bit of background on just exactly what the Office of Attorney General is and what it does?
Yeah, great question. So the Attorney General is really the chief law enforcement officer of the state. It sets the tone for public safety at the city and county level across the state. It also, and as part of that, it's the Attorney General is supposed to run point on all organized crime. That's human trafficking, drug trafficking, organized retail theft, and political crimes. It is also the chief child protection officer of the state. It has a large child protection division. And if you know, the current state of Oregon is that we are terrible at protecting children. We do not have a healthy environment to raise a child in Oregon right now. And then third, it's the anti-corruption wing of the government. It's the portion of the state government that's supposed to hold people accountable for misusing their office or misusing funds.
So kind of like public corruption.
Yep.
So could you identify specifically what part of your platform intersects with the role and responsibilities of Attorney General?
Yeah, I think all of it does. My number one focus in this race is protecting children. That's my background. I've spent 20 years in state, nationally, and internationally working to protect children from violence, exploitation, and abuse. And as I stated, our internet crimes against children is way up. DHS has lost a bunch of kids in DHS custody. They're fostering kids in hotel rooms, so that's a disaster. In almost every way, we're failing our children. That's my first platform, and that's a key role of the Attorney General. Another big part of it is what we just talked about, is the organized drug crime has taken over our state, and we are very disorganized in our response. And it's never been easier to buy and sell drugs in the state of Oregon. And I don't think anybody in Portland will disagree with, there's just been a big uptick in public misuse of funds and public misuse of office. And people are looking for an Attorney General that's actually going to hold people accountable.
That sounds great. So when I was in law enforcement, my experience was that most agencies, they're not checking for registration, sex offender registration. I know it's something that we didn't do. I don't want to tell everyone what my department was,
Right.
but it was my understanding back then, this is a while ago, that the state often rejected federal funds for this purpose, and that there were funds. We were always told there are funds available, but Oregon kind of opts out. And for this reason, we had a very high amount of unregistered sex offenders. They call it a haven, a sex offenders haven,
Interesting.
where people are allowed to come and live in a state where you're not required to on your birthday every year, register at your local PD. So what specifically would you be willing to do, or what platform do you have in place to make sure that something like that doesn't happen?
Yeah, so Oregon has, it is against the law to not register as a sex offender in the state of Oregon, and we have...
I've made those arrests.
And we have what is an increasing culture of lawlessness, and that we have good laws on the books, but nobody's enforcing them. And so, like I say, it's the chief law enforcement officer of the state. And so you can name a lot of different categories. It's against the law to tag buildings. There's graffiti everywhere. It's against the law to park your camper in a residential neighborhood. People are doing it all over the place. Litter, drug trafficking, driving under the influence. We've never seen so much lawlessness, and there's just time for somebody at the top to start, not pass new laws, but actually enforce the laws and do it in a fair but a professional way.
So it's my understanding that the role of the Attorney General comes alongside that local DA, that county DA. What kind of influence can you have over the DA in getting them to prosecute these types of crimes? A
lot of the role of the Attorney General traditionally, when it's working well, is empowering the DAs, giving them expertise, pushing resources to them, training, connecting them to one another, so that if there's organized crime and it's running between counties, that every DA is working together and every police chief and every sheriff is working together and becoming organized. Because the organized crime is very organized, right? And we're disorganized. And so
it's very organized.
The Attorney General traditionally plays a role of bringing people together, building a collective strategy, pushing resources down to the places where they're needed most. And I'm really excited. There's occasions where the Attorney General has to actually go into counties, or because the sheriff or the chief of the police or the DA's not meeting their minimum standard of care in that county. I'm very excited in Multnomah County because there's a new DA that's been elected here, and I think that's going to make a really big difference for Multnomah County. And that was the major gap, obviously.
We
in the
love
state.
Nate Vasquez. He's great.
He's very good, very good.
So, we'll call him the former DA. There was a state institution, a university, a local public university, that had an office here in Portland, and the former DA, they wanted to staff this location with law enforcement. And the former DA, prior to Vasquez, told this institution, a public institution, if you bring your police into Multnomah County and they make arrests, we're not going to prosecute those arrests.
Right.
And so, as Attorney General, what kind of tone can you set? Are you able to go in and help build those bridges and force those meetings? And what do you think?
So my background is, I hate to repeat myself, but I have really strong statewide, national, and international law enforcement experience. My current opponent doesn't have any law enforcement experience. And if we learned anything from Mike Schmidt in his time, his 4 years of being a DA in Multnomah County, is that politicians don't do well in these law enforcement roles. You need people with actual experience and know what they're doing. And so one of his biggest failures is he was playing politics all the time. He didn't actually know how to run the office or how to do the job. And it came back to bite him because, look around, we see the fruits of his leadership every day. And so what can I do? At the statewide level, we need now more than any other time that I can think of in my lifetime, somebody who understands law enforcement, understands the needs of the community, and understands how important public safety is to everything, to business, to communities, to every part of our civic life. And so I think it's really important that we have an experienced person in this role, and I'm the only experienced person.
So it really comes down to that experience.
Yep.
Yeah, I can see that, because if you're a DA or if you're a police chief, you want to be able to relate to that person.
Yes.
And if you feel like that person's going to be a politician,
and trust.
And not another law enforcement. And I can see that.
Yeah, and trust.
That trust needs to be there. So shifting gears, I want to talk about public corruption.
Yeah. So
many years ago at my old police department, I was a whistleblower. I turned to my police chief. At the time, my police chief was engaged in some racist activities. He'd also been sleeping with underage girls. And about several victims came forward and gave testimony to the DOJ. Prior to all of this, I had reached out to the DOJ and said, I have female victims that are saying, hey, if I say anything, he's going to kill me. He said he's going to cut off the heads of my children. Right. And so there were real threats being made by a law enforcement police chief to victims. I reached out to the DOJ multiple times. I'm not going to mention the individual I reached out to, but I never got a phone call back. I actually had to engage the ACLU and the Department of Public Safety to get an investigation started. And eventually the DOJ had to pick it up because they were so serious of allegations. And so what do you see as your role in stopping public corruption? And are you going to, what I would ask is that people in law enforcement or people that are in, serving the public, that we have we have a person, that there's a POC, there's an actual contact that we know. Hey, if you're seeing corruption, if you're a public official and you're seeing corruption, this is who you reach out to, and this is the protocols, and this is what we're going to do to help you.
Yeah. I don't know if I have fresh eyes on this coming back from overseas, but I guess growing up, I always thought of Oregon as a place where most people that were in public service were really in public service to help other people and wouldn't be misusing their office or misusing funds. I was actually pretty shocked to come back and start this race. You would never hear me talking about corruption. I was talking about child protection and drug trafficking and organized crime. But along the way, it became pretty obvious to me that we've always been, or I actually think what is true is just over the last 10 years, we've seen a huge spike in people misusing their office and misusing their funds, and it's largely because nobody ever gets in trouble for it. So my commitment is, and it's going to have to be a commitment, my commitment to regain the public trust, because this is a bipartisan issue. When I talk to people, Republicans, Democrats, non-affiliated voters, they're all very concerned, particularly about where our money's being spent when it comes to addiction and homeless services. And housing services, and just people like you say, at the local level, the county level, the state level, misusing their office. So I think there's going to have to be a recalibration of my office to be able to deal with the new wave of corruption that we've seen in the state of Oregon. Absolutely.
Yeah, because it is happening, and it's very seldom prosecuted or looked into. And I just feel like that's a huge part of that office, the role of that office.
Yeah.
So, kind of, again, I'm changing gears. We're trying to keep this interview short because we're going to go on a ride along. We don't just sit in the office. We go out into the street here, right? The role of the environment. I'm sure there's a lot of voters here in Oregon that are concerned about hiring or electing a Republican and putting them in charge of the environment.
Yeah.
I think Oregon has a great record. Number one, we're a pristine, beautiful state. We want to keep it that way. And so what would you say to voters out there who maybe lack that trust from the Republican Party when it comes to environmental issues? Yeah,
well, so the Attorney General's office is a law enforcement position, not a law creation position. And one of those things is to enforce environmental regulations and enforce environmental law. And I go back to what I said before. You don't want a politician enforcing the law. You want somebody with law enforcement experience enforcing the law. It's not my posture. It's not my background to go and make the law of Will. We have the law of Oregon. I'm really good at enforcing the law. I do it fairly. I do it professionally. I have a long track record of doing that. And if you talk about consumer protection, if you talk about civil rights, anything you bring up and you tell me the law, it's my intention to enforce that law exactly how it's written.
I think that's very reassuring. And I tell you, if it came to one, who was going to oversee, if you were asking me, I'm a registered Democrat, who would I choose to oversee prosecuting people who have polluted or violated the environment? I would want someone from a law enforcement background as well, rather than a politician. Because at the end of the day, it is a prosecution process. It's a process of prosecution. Yeah. And that has to be done very well. And if it's not done well, the appeals court will tear that apart.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so when you're a politician, what's the calculation? The calculation is this going to look good for me? Is this going to be good for my career? Is this going to look good for my party? The calculation when you're in law enforcement is what is the law and what is best for the people of Oregon? And that's always been my calculation, and I hope that it always will be. I'm committed to that.
And you haven't always been a registered a party member, right?
That's
This
right.
is new for you.
Yeah,
Kind of.
I was an unaffiliated voter for a number of years.
You know, when I think of the office of Attorney General, it kind of makes me wonder why it's even politicized to begin with. I mean, why should you have to choose a party to run for as a law enforcement official,
Yeah.
right?
I mean, if it's up to me, if I had a magic wand, I'd make it a nonpartisan position because I think it should be, and I think that favors my background as a really nonpartisan prosecutor and human rights lawyer.
Yeah, because you're not a part of any national Republican strategy.
No.
Your message is, I'm an Oregonian, I care about Oregon, right?
You're exactly right.
And we don't want a politician in this role. We want someone from law enforcement that we can trust
Yeah.
to execute laws
Yep.
and to use the power of prosecution evenly, regardless of who the individuals are.
Exactly, and this, I might be older than you, but when I grew up, the Republican Party was dominated by Hatfield Republicans. It was a different kind of Republican at the time. In those days, a Republican and Democrat weren't so far apart. We'd argue about a couple things and then ultimately get along because I think at the end of the day we were all libertarians. But over the course of the last several decades, and particularly in the last decade, there's been so much division across the country, and it's mirrored itself here in Oregon, where the radical parts of each party are taking over and really politicizing every single thing. Every civic position now becomes very politicized, and I harken back to the days where we were a more unified Oregon, and we were really trying to put Oregon first and not our national politics first. And so I'm really running to be a wave, and you'll hear me say this over and over, I'm running to be a wave of new leadership that's positioned to protect people and solve problems and reject political influence. And people say, I'm in Portland all the time, people say, well, this is bad about Republicans or that's bad about Republicans. And I say, if you want the right kind of Republican, you can vote for them. And I think I'm that person.
Very well said. So, kind of changing gears again.
Yeah.
Over the past, I would say, 7 to 10 years, there's been a dramatic decrease in recruiting numbers for law enforcement.
Yeah.
And if your role is to come alongside that local DA and law enforcement agencies and kind of bolster their local efforts,
Yeah.
and then also organize a statewide effort with multiple agencies when it comes to fighting organized crime, how do you do that going forward when you know all of the agencies you're going to be working with are hurting for those recruiting numbers?
Exactly. Because I know when I was a child sex abuse prosecutor at that time, I didn't make any more money than anybody else that was handling. Those cases are very, very difficult. They take a huge toll on your life, and they're really time consuming. I mean, you can't lose a trial and let a pedophile go free because you know what will happen next. And so when you're prosecuting those kind of cases, it's all consuming, but you're making the same amount of money as every other prosecutor and working more hours. But for a prosecutor makes way less than a civil trial attorney or something like that. So it wasn't about the money and it wasn't about the quality of life. To me, it was about doing the right thing, that I could say at the end of the day, I was doing something big for my community that was really, really important. So the minute that you told prosecutors or police officers that they were the bad people and that they were the ones that were causing all of the problems around us, of course, a lot of people left the profession because that was the payment that they had. When a police officer knows he's going to get shot at, die at an early age, see all this secondary trauma, deal with all the things you deal with on a day-to-day basis, in the end of the day, you're going to have the citizens swearing at them and telling them they're the bad people and trying to defund them and take away protections from them. Of course, we've seen this mass exodus. So in order to change the culture of law enforcement in the state of Oregon, it needs to start at the top. They need to have an ambassador that actually knows the profession, the industry, and can speak to it. Our Attorney General did nothing whatsoever. My opponent did nothing when we were tearing down our criminal justice institutions in 2020 and 2021. If they did anything, it was just to join in. And so one of the reasons why law enforcement leaders across the state are consistently endorsing my campaign, even though I'm a Republican running in Oregon, is they know what it will mean to have somebody that understands their perspective. A guy who will hold law enforcement accountable if they break the law. If they're corrupt, they should be held to a higher account, but will protect the institution when it needs to happen, and it needs to happen.
Yeah, that does make sense. It makes sense to hire someone from the industry to run the industry. Kind of balancing that out, it's also your role as Attorney General to be aware of civil rights violations, right? And so I guess one way it could be said is that when two regular individuals violate each other, that's a crime. You get arrested, it's a crime. But when the government does it to an individual, it can be a crime, but it's also a civil rights violation.
Yep.
And so the government is responsible for the civil rights violations that occur, and most of those are typically law enforcement agents.
Yeah.
Right? Because in law enforcement, and this is kind of a provocative statement, but it's reality. If you're going to go into law enforcement, you need to understand this. As a law enforcement agent, your job is to violate people's rights, legally, ethically, and morally correct, and to do it 100% right all the time, 100%. So if you're going to do a traffic stop and you're going to legally violate that person's rights, you have to do it right. You can't extend the stop, whether it's a search, whether it's a search warrant. So whatever we're doing in law enforcement, we have to do it legally, ethically, and morally perfect. Mm-hmm. Knowing that you're responsible, or the Attorney General's office is responsible for the oversight, mm-hmm. but you're also responsible for building the industry that could be possibly leading to these civil rights violations. Yep. How do you balance that internal structure?
Yeah, you have to balance it. So rather than say violate the rights, I'd probably use the word infringe upon people's freedoms. You have to do that in law enforcement because you believe there or you suspect there was a crime or you investigate
reasonable
a crime,
suspicion, probable cause,
all of those things, and anybody who gets caught in an either or argument when it comes to law enforcement misses the point. The law enforcement has to infringe upon certain freedoms so that we have public safety, so that we're all protected.
And we have jails.
We can all have some sort of a semblance of a safe life. And at the same time, law enforcement need to know what they're allowed to do and why they're allowed to do it. They need to know the consequences of what happens when you go beyond it. Because if you're going beyond what you're allowed legally to do in your profession, then you're now becoming, as you said, the person that's supposed to uphold the law is now breaking the law. And the thing that I usually say when I'm speaking on this issue is that, and I would say most law enforcement leaders I've ever been around agree with this, is that you have a fiduciary duty as a law enforcement. You wear the badge, you have the uniform. When you violate that fiduciary duty to the public, when you break the law, you should be held accountable to a higher account. And
that's who you are. You're the person. Mm-hmm. You're law enforcement for law enforcement.
Exactly. But they need to be trained. They need to know what that legal bounds is, and you need to have some wisdom and some grace about some of that as well. But at the end of the day, you also need somebody that understands how important the law enforcement institution is mm-hmm. to every single thing that we're doing.
Yeah, you can't let cartels take over.
No. Yeah. We've learned that. We've learned that there has to be a balance.
So speaking of the cartels, many moons ago when I started here in law enforcement in Oregon, we were told by the gang / organized crime instructor at the academy that they had no national affiliation of any gangs or criminal organizations, meaning there wasn't an organized unit that was paying dues nationally. Mm-hmm. We only had 2 members of the Sureños, or the SAs, in Oregon State Prison. No members of the Aryan Brotherhood. They weren't involved. And this is what we were told. And that the only real organized crime were biker gangs, right? And so fast forward to today, you go on the streets today and you'll have Venezuelan gangs, Honduran gangs, and these are legit criminal organizations.
Right.
I know having worked with multiple agencies, the Russians are here, the Chinese are operating as well. And a lot of these organizations, because of the legalization of marijuana and the decriminalization of narcotics, they've kind of turned Oregon into a hub. Mm-hmm. And they said, hey, we're going to set up shop. It's very rural. You're very unlikely to see law enforcement if you're out in the middle of nowhere. We're going to buy some land, set up shop, and we're going to use this as a shipping port, right? So this is kind of all of the stuff coming in from the West Coast or from Mexico up goes across east to the country, right, to Chicago and Detroit. So explain your platform and or at least your vision on how you plan on taking that on.
Yeah, so just so probably a lot of your listeners already know this, but methamphetamine, and to a greater degree, fentanyl is made in China. It's processed in Mexico, and it's brought here by a very organized, think about it as a wholesaler, a very organized drug cartel. And then it's distributed by other drug cartels and gang organizations in different areas of the country. You'll have different gangs or different organizations distributing. And so the role of the Attorney General is to run point on all organized crime, all distribution that happens in the state of Oregon. We're just not really doing that. And you're right.
Well, no, we have a fentanyl crisis.
We have a fentanyl crisis, and then we legalize.
A direct reflection of the current Attorney General.
We have the fentanyl sweeps America. We legalize drugs, and then we stop really. We sort of tear down the connection between our law enforcement agencies across the state, and it's this perfect recipe for an explosion of drug crimes in the state of Oregon. If you are listening to HIDA is sort of a federal agency that tracks drug activities through data internationally, you realize that to have any real impact on the drug cartel or any organized drug crime in the state of Oregon, one, we have to be extremely organized ourselves. We have to do what I said earlier. We have to bring law enforcement together and build a collective strategy. We also have to plug into the federal government, which we've really unplugged from in the last 10 years. And that's the FBI, that's DEA, that's Interpol. Interpol can work cases in federally, across federal lines. Because in order to make this a place that, I want to make Oregon a place where it's exceedingly difficult to get fentanyl and methamphetamine. It's exceedingly difficult to sell it here. And the only way to do that is to send a message outside of our state that if you bring drugs in our state, you're going to go to jail, whether you're here or not.
In a very similar fashion, crimes against children, specifically those on the internet. I was a sex crimes investigator, child sex crimes investigator. And it's heartbreaking, but a lot of this activity is also driven by larger criminal organizations. Yeah. And so exactly what kind of task force, is there a current task force in place? Yeah. And how do you see that task force evolving into becoming more effective?
So internet crimes against children are exploding all across the globe. When I was in Ghana, every year, in Ghana, in West Africa, the number of children that were exposed to online sexual exploitation was doubling by the year. So I was training the Ghanaian police on how to deal with these kinds of crimes in a place where computers are new and somewhat foreign. And so in Oregon, your kids have never really had more access. I have an 8-year-old son. He's never had more access to people across the globe. They have phones, iPads, computers, video games, and all these things are connected. So people across the globe have access to your children. And there's been this explosion of sexual exploitation through that access. There's been a 520% increase in online exploitation of children cases in the state of Oregon. And we still have 5 investigators at the Department of Justice, the same 5 investigators that were there more than a decade ago when I was trying those cases in Salem. Idaho, which has, I think, less than half of our population, has 21 investigators building their safety net for their children. Washington, last I checked, has 28 investigators building their safety net. And we have 5, and I think the legislature just added a few more positions as well, but we are not taking online sexual exploitation of children seriously. It's leaving our kids really exposed, and we're gonna be paying for it for decades.
So it sounds like what I hear you saying is, as Attorney General, you're gonna go to the legislature and ask them to billet new offices of investigators and to give you more investigators? We
need to greatly increase the resources, not only at the Department of Justice to deal with this, but at each local police municipality. But money, and we're seeing with homelessness or addiction, money is only so good as how you use it. So we need to build in an expertise. We need to bring in national help, and we have a huge amount of ground to cover just to become average compared to the states around us. And so, yeah, I'll be asking for money, but I'll also be putting a lot of attention and a lot of weight into bringing in expertise and actually driving this prevalence down by data.
That's great.
Yeah.
Will, I'm really glad you came in today. It's great to see you. I really believe in your platform. Could you tell the audience how they can get a hold of you, where they can find you online?
Yeah, so if you go to my website, it's willathrop.com. That's my name, WILLLATHROP.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, X, or Instagram and see what we're up to and what activities you can get involved in. But yeah, just go to my website, and I'd be happy to answer any questions if you have it or if you want to volunteer or anything else. We're happy.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming in to the studio. But now we're going to hit the streets because on the streets of Portland, people are dying every day. There's a fentanyl crisis. There's a huge lack of, there's a gap in services, humanitarian services, not just law enforcement. And so we're going to go out there, we're going to experience that up and close. You know, this is what we do. We're going to meet up with Bach, America's Security Guard, and we're going to see if we can kind of talk to anyone on the street. You want to go talk to some folks?
Yeah, I'm excited.
All right, let's hit the
Yep.
streets. Thanks.
Okay.